I'd like to take some time to show you how to use the Chrome browser inspection tools. And that will enable you in the future to use that in the process of debugging websites and debugging web pages, and analyzing how web pages are being used, and in being able to get some data about the user experience around load times and how different web pages get laid out in different contexts. So particularly in this lecture, we're going to talk about the Chrome web browser. Other web browsers also have inspection tools, but we'll look at the Chrome browser inspection in particular. So at a high level, the Chrome browser provides a lot of information for understanding what is happening, what a web page is doing within the context of a browser. Safari also does this. Firefox does it as well. I imagine that Internet Explorer does also. Not as familiar with those, but I do know that Chrome has very sophisticated resources for being able to understand what's happening during the process of requesting resources from the Internet and rendering them for a user. So we'll focus on that tool in this lecture. So the basic problem is that it's very hard to see what a server has sent to you in response to a URL request. You might have a well-formed URL with a scheme and a domain name and a path, maybe a query and parameters, maybe a fragment, maybe a port, maybe even a username and password on it. When you issue that request into a browser and your browser uses the domain name service to look up the IP address and then requests the resource using the entire internet and the path of computers along the way, at some point the remote web server is going to form a file, a set of data, of text, that's going to give back to the web browser. The web browser is going to receive that file, and it's going to have to render it. It's going to have to turn that text file into a picture, something that can be presented to the user. It's often difficult to know, especially if you're responsible for creating the content on the web server, what exactly is being sent back to the browser. So a tool that you can use to help debug what's being sent back is the view source command on a web browser. So in the Chrome browser, if you want to look at view source, let me show you how you can do that. We'll use the UCI website as a basis, and we'll go into the browser and we'll type in uci.edu and load up the content. There are two ways that we can do it. We can use it by right-clicking on the web page and then looking at view page source. And from there, you can see all the text that was delivered by the server at uci.edu. UCI's web page happens to have a lot of white space. You can also go under the menu bar under Developer Tools and look at View Source, and you'll get the same information. Again, with lots of white space in between. What you can see is a file. It's got the browser has put line numbers along the left side, but all the text that you see that's there has been delivered by the web server. The color coding is not part of the file. The color coding is part of what the browser is doing to help you be able to read the format of this file more efficiently. A lot of tags and information there that you might not be familiar with, but what you can see is that in the blue, there are a lot of references to other URLs as well. So it turns out that oftentimes when you load a document from a remote server, that document has references to other documents as well. And that requires the browser to go out and make another request in order to fill out the details of the document. So the first thing that's helpful here is seeing exactly what was delivered back from the web server. And so if you're generating the content on the web server, you can look at this and you can say, oh, is that what I meant to send? Did I have any errors? Trying to debug maybe what gets sent back. This is the raw data that's being sent back from the web server. So another thing that you might like to know is okay, once the web browser has received that file, what is it doing with it? How can I evaluate whether or not the browser is interpreting what I've written there in the way that I want it to? So to do that, you can look at the developer tools. And the developer tools is a suite, again, of sophisticated resources that you have available to you to help debug the process of drawing your web page. In Chrome, we access the developer tools usually by going through the menu bar and under Developer, opening Developer Tools. You can also right-click on the web page and use the Inspect element in order to open up the developer tools. So let's see how to access those tools and to see how the browser interprets our URL. So if we go under View and we go under Developer, we can open Developer Tools, and that's going to open this bottom half of the browser with a bunch of different information. So for example, we can click on Elements, and in the Elements tab, we're going to see all the ways in which that file that was delivered by view source has been interpreted by the browser. So there's a very close relationship between elements and view source. But view source is the raw information that's coming back, and elements is what the browser has done to clean up the contents of that file that's been sent to you. Maybe there was an error in the format of the file that was being sent, and the browser does its best effort to try and formulate it into something it can understand. Also, in the context of interacting with a web page, the representation of the web page might deviate, might change from what it was initially sent as the web browser. This is because the document object model, what you're looking at in Elements, gets modified over time as you interact with the web page. All right, so that is how we access the developer tools, and that's also seeing how the browser has interpreted the content of our source page, interpreted the contents of what we saw in view source. Another thing we might like to see is hey, what would our web page look like if it was rendered in different sized windows? Well, when would that ever happen? Well, it would happen if you had different sized screens, if your browser size were changed. It would happen if you were browsing this website on a phone or a tablet platform. So Chrome has some basic built-in tools for being able to look at that information. So if you click on this little icon here, you can actually choose several different layouts that you might like to look at your web page in. A Galaxy phone, an iPad Pro. You can even rotate the iPad Pro. So these are tools that are built into the browser that enable you to pick different sizes of the browser. For example, if you're testing whether or not your web page is effectively responsive to changes in the size of your screen. Or you can check specific sizes that are associated with common phone platforms as well. By changing the size, you can see if your representation of your data is doing what you expected it to do. And you can do it pretty quickly. So that's what's available to you in a Chrome tool. By clicking on that little icon in the upper left, you can change the size in which your content is being rendered. Very helpful for getting a quick feel of whether your responsive website has been written correctly. Now, another thing you can do is you can evaluate whether or not the browser has identified any errors in your source for your web page. So you can look at that by looking at the console. And the console will have a list of log messages that are printed out. I just reloaded the page. So a list of errors that are produced in the process of trying to retrieve your website and then trying to render it for you. Sometimes this can be helpful in debugging whether or not your web page is well formed maybe, but whether or not it is doing what you expected. If you click on sources, you can see all the external resources that are required in order to render your web page. When we looked at view source, we saw references to all these different images, different resources, and you can see here as we browse through the elements, you can click on the individual images and resources that were loaded and see them out of the context of the web page itself. In fact, if we go down here and we look at, there we go. Okay. And so the last thing that we can do is we can look at how the network resources were loaded as we loaded the page. So if you open the network tab and you hit refresh, down the left-hand side, each of the resources that are being loaded, starting with the very first resource you wanted from the URL you specified, and then moving down for all the pictures that you needed, any additional formatting information you needed, maybe font information, maybe advertisement code, maybe other JavaScript, all kinds of information that's required in order to render your web page that requires more requests than your initial requests are being shown on the left side. As you click through each one, you can see what took the time, where did the time go in trying to retrieve that resource? How much of it was because of the DNS latency? How much of it was because of the amount of time a large file just took to get to you? How much of it was because it needed to be processed maybe once it arrived at the browser? And then you can see, for example, this picture here is a very large background picture for this web page, and you can see that the blue bar is very large, and because of that, a big part of this website, the latency of this website had to do with loading that very large picture for the first time. And you can see that most of the time of rendering that picture was in transferring it from the web server to. If you click through the different elements, you can see really interesting different breakdowns of what took the time for each of the different resources in the network request. At the top, with that little bar graph, you can see the full set of resources and how much time each one required. And you can see that early on, resources that are requested that take a lot of time continue to be downloaded or processed while future resources are being loaded in parallel or asynchronously from the first result. Until at the end, all of the details of the web page have been brought in, and the browser makes its best effort at various points along the way to show you a picture that represents the final result, possibly with incomplete information. So you can see this sometimes if you're loading a web page and maybe a background image hasn't loaded, or maybe you'll see the information coming in and being rendered, and then everything will jump just a little bit as more text comes in, or the exact sizes of the images have been determined. Browsers do the best they can in order to render content as quickly as they can to keep you from feeling like you're waiting for the web page to load, even if some of the resources are large or exist far away on the internet or take a long time to transfer. Finally, if you look up in the timeline tab and you reload the web page, you can get an even more sophisticated analysis of the web page performance. This will tell you, for example, in the overall scheme, you can look at that pie chart down there. You can look at the overall scheme of rendering your website, what was taking most of the time. And in this case, you can see that the orange bar was taking most of the time, and that is mostly due to JavaScript having to run in order to help with the interactivity of the web page. If you wanted to reduce the amount of time the web page took to load, you would have to somehow reduce the amount of JavaScript that was being run before the web page could be rendered. And you can see a lot of other information resources to drill down into the content and see exactly what's taking time to get this web page to the user. So that's a summary of some of the tools that are available to you as a developer, as a user experience analyst, as someone who's just curious about what's taking a web page time to load, where the resources are coming from. Chrome is one of the browsers that provides a lot of detail about web page rendering. Other browsers do as well. Some of the things that you can learn from looking at these resources, looking at these developer tools, is what exactly was obtained from a URL, meaning what kind of source text was obtained from the URL. What does that URL look like when it's rendered in different sized browsers? What would it look like if it was rendered on a phone in portrait or landscape orientation? How did the browser actually interpret the URL? How did it translate that URL text into a data object that it could manipulate? What other URLs were loaded in addition to the one that I initially requested, and how much time did each of them take? Finally, what was the overall reason my web page took so long to load, or I guess on a good day, why was my web page so fast? These are some tools that are helpful to use in developing more sophisticated user experience analysis of web pages, or perhaps in debugging web applications that you're writing, or helping to debug other people's web applications as well. These will help you form a correct mental model of what the computation underlying the web page actually is being used for. Thank you.